Picasso is buried here in the south of France, in the garden of one of his houses, the Château de Vauvenargues. He had lived in the Midi since the end of the Second World War and was in good health and working constantly until he died in 1973 at the age of 91. He left one of the largest bodies of works ever created by a single artist, works as controversial and many-sided as the man himself. Perhaps more than anyone else, Picasso has changed the course of 20th century art, and by the end of his life, he had become the most photographed and best-known artist of our time. Picasso was born in the Spanish city of Malaga in 1881, the son of Don José Ruiz and Doña Maria Picasso. His father was a painter and art teacher whose favorite motif seems to have been pigeons. His genius was already clear at age 5. Then he still signed his works with the family name, Ruiz. In 1895, Picasso's father was called to a post in Barcelona, a move of great importance to young Pablo's progress, as the city at that time was a lively center of Catalan art. At age 14, Picasso had already progressed so far that he could be considered a mature artist. He completed his entrance exams to the School of Fine Arts in Barcelona in just one day and was admitted into the advanced classes. At 16, he painted this remarkable canvas, Science and Charity. Overwhelmed by his son's talent, Don José is said to have given Pablo his palette, brushes, and colors, declaring that he would never paint again. Picasso continued his progress in Madrid. He spent much time at the Prado, studying the great Spanish masters, Goya, El Greco, and Velázquez. Like most art students, he made copies of their works. Horta de Ebro, a remote country town where Picasso stayed 8 months with an artist friend and his family, allowed him to improve his frail health. Here, he painted the surrounding landscape and made drawings of the peasants of Horta. He felt new strength and inspiration through the simple, earthy Spanish country life. In 1909, just after the outset of his Cubist phase, Picasso returned to Horta, a place most meaningful to him. At the turn of the century, Barcelona's avant-garde met daily at a cafe called the Four Cats, Quatre Gats. Picasso produced posters and menus for the famous cafe. The conversation around the tables at the Four Cats in those days was about Nietzsche, Gauguin, and Van Gogh. But above all, they talked about Paris, then the center of art and culture in the Western world, where everyone wanted to go. In 1900, Picasso and a friend decided to visit Paris to see for themselves. Picasso documented his journey through a sequence of comical drawings. Once in Paris, Picasso stayed near Montmartre, in the studio of a Spanish artist friend, and eagerly absorbed all the art that this city had to offer. For the first time in his life, he saw the work of Toulouse-Lautrec, Degas, and Renoir. Picasso quickly picked up on the rhythms and styles of these painters and made many of his own interpretations of similar scenes of Parisian life. However, he soon established his own style. Blue was the pervasive color. It expressed his deep melancholy about the plight of the poor and those struggling for survival, and the cast of characters reflected his own poverty. This painting, Blind Man's Meal of 1903, is a perfect example of the blue period. It seems to have absorbed many of the spiritual as well as visual and structural qualities of the paintings of El Greco, whose work Picasso studied closely at the Prado in Madrid. El Greco's astonishing liberty in elongating, stretching, and straining the human figure gives it almost a sense of a visionary saintly quality, something that Picasso seems to have learned an enormous lesson from, not only in this painting, but in many paintings that stem from the Blue period. The question of sight has always been of great importance for Picasso. The blind man's sensitive face and hands are a moving contrast to the pitiful blank socket of his eye. This fascination with the eyes as a source of a kind of magical or inward experience is something that one finds throughout these years, as in this painting, La Celestina. His enormous preoccupation with staring eyes, some blank, some intensely seeing, is reflected in much of his later work, especially the Demoiselle d'Avignon. By 1904, Picasso had settled permanently in Paris in the legendary Bateau Louvois, a picturesque artist commune in the heart of the Bohemian Montmartre section. Here the art critic and poet Apollinaire, as well as the poet Max Jacob, befriended the young Spaniard, and their enthusiasm for his work gave him new confidence. Dominique Bozo is chief curator of the new Picasso Museum in Paris.
Picasso's friends, the poets Max Jacob, André Salmon, and Apollinaire, came regularly to the Bateau Louvois, and a whole intellectual and political life developed in this neighborhood. So it was not unusual that many foreign artists settled in Montmartre. This was a modest neighborhood when Picasso moved here in 1904, and he stayed in the same studio for 5 years. Most important in terms of his work is that the great explosion called the Demoiselle d'Avignon happened here in 1907. And it was here that Picasso met his future dealer, Henri Kahnweiler, and also Georges Braque.
The girl next door at the Bateau Louvois was Fernand Olivier, who shared his life for 7 years. This strong relationship brought about a change in Picasso's work. An optimistic rose tone began to appear in his paintings. His focus shifted to circus artists who replaced the melancholy figures of the Blue period. The following summer, he was invited to Holland by a young Dutch writer and his wife. An important painting which he brought back to Paris from this foray into a culture that must have surprised the Spanish artist is his Three Dutch Girls. Actually, the idea of a classical and monumental triple grouping of figures is one that recurred constantly in Picasso's work, like, for instance, The Three Women of 1908, The Three Women at the Well of 1921, and it had its most famous reincarnation in The Three Musicians of 1921. The Three Dutch Girls also evokes the classical theme of the Three Graces. In 1906, the rose changed to a deeper terracotta tone, which Picasso adopted during a summer in Spain. In the following year, he began to look for the first time at the pre-Christian sculpture of his native Spain. This was to have an immediate impact on his interpretations of the human countenance and figure. The influence of these primitive shapes on Picasso resulted in a shocking painting, which he revealed to startled friends in 1907. Robert Rosenblum is an art historian and a Picasso scholar.
If one were to take a vote on which picture was the first painting of the 20th century, I think the answer is pretty obvious. It would be this one here, the Demoiselle d'Avignon of 1907. And the sense that it marks the beginning of a whole new epoch, I think, is even more clear if one just looks backwards to a picture like that painted by Picasso in 1905, 2 years earlier, the family of Saltimbanques. It's amazing because in that picture, the mood is one of withdrawal. Everybody looks emaciated. There's a feeling that everyone is heaving a kind of last sigh. Whereas suddenly, just 2 years later, there's this electrifying picture that looks as though, well, I don't know how many bolts of lightning have struck 5 figures and have really shattered the world in many pieces, from which Picasso had to construct something completely new. One of the fascinating things about the history of this painting, I think, has to do with the changing way in which people have seen it over the last decades. In the middle of the 20th century, after people got used to it at all, the painting was largely thought about in terms of how it looked forward to the development of Cubism. And people were virtually blind to the subject of the painting, which represents the parlor in a brothel and shows us 5 of the prostitutes there displaying their wares. The scene tended to include, in some of Picasso's earlier ideas for the painting, male figures, that is, the clients, who had come in, as it were, to inspect the produce there and then to enjoy themselves in the bordello. In the final version, which you have here, Picasso has done something extraordinary, which is to remove, so to say, the client and to turn him into you, the spectator. That is, suddenly these women, instead of confronting the men in the bordello scene, are staring out at you who are looking at the picture, and the full force of their sexual ferocity is apparent to anybody who sees this picture for not only the first time, but for the 100th time. Because one of the most amazing things about it is that it manages somehow to preserve, even after a whole century, the terrific impact, the sense of violence, of physical sexual force that so astonished the few people who were privileged enough to see it and to be bewildered by it when Picasso first painted it in the middle of 1907.
Picasso's friends could not accept this strange new painting. Matisse was hostile to it, as was Georges Braque. Only the young German art dealer, Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, recognized it as a potential masterpiece. Bordello scenes were not an uncommon theme at the turn of the century. They were a favorite subject for the painter Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. The posture of the nude, with both of her arms raised behind her neck, is a very familiar image of sexual surrender that goes back in the history of modern painting to the Naked Maja by Goya, a painting which Picasso had seen in the Prado. Less well-known, yet most likely of greater impact, were a series of monotypes by Degas of the late 1870s, representing the life of prostitutes in a bordello in Paris. For a while, Picasso continued to explore the style of the demoiselle, although the painting itself was not exhibited publicly for almost another decade. In 1909, Picasso and Fernand spent the summer in Spain. The houses in the villages and small towns, reminiscent of Cubist shapes, left a deep impression on Picasso. In Horta de Ebro, he worked on a series of landscapes. He also painted portraits of Fernand. Here's a rare photograph of his studio during that summer. In the following year, Picasso and Fernand stayed in the small Mediterranean fishing village of Cadaqués, where Picasso further developed the language of Cubism. Throughout 1909 and 1910, Picasso created a number of spectacular Cubist portraits of friends, Paris art world figures, who recognized his work as radically new and revolutionary. These paintings veer back and forth between two contradictory modes. On the one hand, Much of the painting seemed to be illegible, with seas of fractured planes. Yet at the same time, it is as if we are looking at some sort of blurry photographic image that suddenly comes into sharp focus. Here we see the art dealers Vallard and Wilhelm Ude. After his return from Cadaqués, Picasso left the Bateau Lavoie for more comfortable quarters on the Boulevard Clichy, together with Fernand. A maid was hired to help Fernand with household chores, an unmistakable sign of Picasso's rising success. But soon Fernand was replaced by a fragile young woman, Eva Guel. Picasso dedicated these paintings to Eva with bold printed letters, Ma jolie, my pretty one. The use of letters became an important Cubist innovation. Georges Braque and Picasso visited each other regularly and exchanged ideas. The result was a series of paintings which are almost impossible to distinguish from one another. In the next stage of this revolutionary art form, all sorts of materials, heretofore unheard of in the making of art, were used. Paper, tin, string, and bits and pieces of advertisements were applied to canvases along with paint, resulting in collage, or sometimes in sculpture-like constructions. Modern sculpture literally began with these constructions of 1912. They made fun of the academics, who only accepted marble and bronze as materials for sculpture. In 1914, the world was at war. Paris was deserted and grim. Most of Picasso's artist friends were at the front. Picasso bade his friend Braque goodbye by trying on his uniform. After the war, their friendship was never quite the same. Each went his own way. In 1916, Jean Cocteau invited Picasso to design the sets and costumes of the Ballet Parade for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. Cocteau was the writer, Eric Satie the composer. Picasso eagerly accepted this invitation, a relief from the everyday tragedies of war, opening for him the fantasy world of the theater. The theater, the circus, the bullfight had always been fascinating for him. Picasso thrived on heightened emotion. The ballet became a strong seduction for him and led him into a semi-realistic theatrical flatness. Cubism had really run its course for Picasso by this time. Picasso fell in love with the elegant young ballerina, Olga Koklova, a member of Diaghilev's company. In the summer of 1918, Olga and Picasso were married in Paris. Late that same year, the couple took up residence in 2 apartments in the very smart Rue de la Boétie. Picasso, who had never really had a formal studio, used one of their apartments to work in, while Olga held court rather than kept house in the other. They became very much a part of elegant Paris, a mixture of the privileged and the intelligentsia. It was Olga who was socially ambitious, but Picasso didn't seem to mind this change of milieu. Picasso returned to a solid, gravity-bound world again. His monumental women were partly inspired by the marble statues he had seen while in Rome with Diaghilev's ballet company, a return to classicism by way of Cubism, the beginning of his famous neoclassical period. At first glance, this neoclassical painting, Still Life with Picture, seems to be a very modest still life, a sort of restatement of a painting modeled in the old-fashioned way. But at a closer look, references to the Cubist past begin to surface. For instance, the restriction to a narrow range of colors, dull beiges and grays, the kind of palette that he had explored in the Cubist years. The word neoclassical is appropriate because this painting seems to be an effort to resurrect the spirit of the art of Greece and Rome. It is very telling that the date of this painting coincides with the conclusion of the First World War. Picasso, like many other artists of the time, must have felt the need to reaffirm the values of tradition. But the painting also has a strangely animated quality, expanding and contracting before our eyes, a legacy of Cubism's shifting spaces. In 1921, Olga and Picasso had a son, Pablo. It was a marvelous stimulation to Picasso to have something as eventful in his life as a child. Pablo was 3 years old when Picasso painted this picture. And in fact, in 1921, and in the years thereafter, Picasso painted and drew a whole series of pictures of mothers and children, offering, as it were, restatements a la Picasso of the great Western theme of the Madonna and child. One might expect a painting like this to be sort of cute, or cuddly, or cherubic, but in fact, it has about it something of the gravity that relates it more closely to the Pipes of Pan of the year before, with those solemn, classical faces, one of which seems to be almost like Picasso himself. These faces really are kindred spirits to that of this unsmiling child, who has a kind of blank, but also inward stare. In the late 1920s, Picasso's marriage with Olga began to show signs of strain and discord. The recent Picasso retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City subtly reveals the confluence of both style and subject matter of the artist at that time. Picasso dealt with his turbulent marital life by describing it on canvas. William Rubin, the museum's director of painting and sculpture, explains his approach in assembling this particular part of the exhibition.
What we've tried to do in this gallery was to show something of the variety and range of Picasso's images of the artist and model as he developed that theme in the late 20s. Here, for example, is an etching which Picasso made to illustrate Balzac's novelette, The Unknown Masterpiece. The model and the artist are drawn in a very realistic manner, but the picture on the easel is a tangle of lines. The perception that it is a woman knitting is of no significance in this particular instance, or let us say of very little significance. The picture is rather of interest for us as a more abstract tangle of lines. And when we turn to the picture that we hung directly to the side of it, this very large picture, it looks like it almost might be of the nature of the one that's hanging on the left in the wall. For example, at first appearance, it hardly seems like a recognizable subject, a tangle of lines. The more we look at the picture, the more it becomes clear that it's really a kind of artist and model picture with the model stretched out here, and the artist working over here on the right. You can see his head, his eyes, his mouth. His arm is here, and his hand holding the brush, picking up colors from the palette, which is over here. So finally, what we discover is that this tangle of lines is ironically exactly the same subject as the very realistic etching made at virtually the same time. And if you look at the same subject as it appears on the other side of the doorway, that when we look at this picture, we see that the artist, who is here, his head, body, arm, holding brush, the artist and the model, her head here, her body here, are abstract, and the picture on the easel, this is the canvas with its tacks in the side, is realistic. All the styles which he had practiced earlier in his life are now available simultaneously, and he can call on any one of these as feeling wants him to call on. Now, we set this up in such a way that the viewer who looked at it very carefully might discover that the head, this classical, neoclassical profile, if you wish, on the canvas here, which happens actually to be a profile of Picasso himself, is picked up in the next room, in which we see it as a self-portrait of Picasso hanging on the wall of the room of his house. And seen against it is a very distorted image of a woman, Olga Picasso, when the marriage between Picasso and Olga had degenerated to constant bickering and fighting. Olga became hysterical and no doubt spent a great deal of time screaming at Picasso, just as we see her in this picture. The expressiveness of that distorted and abstract image of Olga becomes all the more telling because it is seen against this realistic and placid profile portrait of Picasso himself. It's as if he's saying, oh, well, I maintain my dignity here even though this woman is screaming at me. Actually, Picasso was very disturbed, as you can well imagine, about what was going on, and we're going to see some of the effects of that disturbance here in the next gallery, because as you pass from this picture to the one which you can see down on the far wall here, and we intended people to see this relationship, this is Olga at a moment when she is in fact yawning with her mouth wide open, and it's as if that moment of temporary relaxation has turned the whole body into a kind of gelatin. The arms and legs flop over the edges of the chair as if they had no bone structure, nothing holding them together. And it permits Picasso to show her with this wide open mouth again and with a new configuration for her head that is now more biomorphic, more organic. It looks almost primordial, like a piece of some kind of dinosaur bone with teeth in it. And finally, we get to an extraordinary image of Olga, which we can compare in our mind with Olga yawning in the armchair, because if there she was entirely gelatinous, the image of the body as it feels at that moment of relaxation of the yawn, here she's entirely bony and hard. This is the real Olga now, as Picasso sees her, relentless, with a head like a praying mantis, vice-like jaws, and with a body which is little more than bone. In any event, what is interesting about this figure is its relation to this sculpture, a sculpture which, as you can see, Picasso put together out of found objects. There are colanders which form the head, the hairs, which remind us of the hairs shooting out behind the head of Olga in the picture that we've already looked at, and the hardness, the violence implied in this kind of image of the human figure, which has echoes, if not direct citations, from certain kinds of African and oceanic art, suggests a kind of raw primitiveness and violence in the figure of the woman. So the sculpture was juxtaposed to this vice-like head of Olga here, in the hope that the viewer would see not a direct similarity, but some binding character between them.
At this time, Picasso met through a chance encounter on a Paris street Marie-Thérèse Voltaire, 17 years old, who was to be a major inspiration for the next 6 years. In contrast to his unhappy life with Olga, Marie-Thérèse symbolized happiness and sensuous pleasure, as seen in these paintings. They reflect Picasso's rapture with this ideal new woman in his life. In order to continue his work on sculpture and to be with Marie-Thérèse, away from the confines of Paris and his wife Olga, Picasso bought a country chateau in Bois-Jaloux, not far from Paris. Here Picasso created many inspired works. In 1932, he painted Girl Before a Mirror, an image of the dual nature in every human being, in this case, Marie-Thérèse's. The mirror is the reflector of the soul. Marie-Thérèse's classic features and Greek profile were the inspiration for a number of three-dimensional works. The marvelously sensual plaster heads are reminiscent both of the distortions of Cubism and the serenity of classical Greek art. 1935, Picasso became a father for the second time when Marie-Thérèse gave birth to his first daughter, Maya. At this point, Picasso's homeland was threatened by the insurrection of General Francisco Franco. Spain became a battlefield, foreshadowing the destruction of Europe during World War II. The Republican government of Spain commissioned Picasso to create a mural for the Spanish Pavilion at the 1937 Paris World's Fair. Picasso now needed a large studio, and he moved to an historic house on the Rue des Grands Augustins. On April 26, 1937, Hitler's Air Force attacked the small town of Guernica in northern Spain with modern warplanes. The air raid on the Basque capital provided the drama that Picasso needed to accomplish his assignment. The painting is named Guernica.
If you can imagine a painting that represented the end of the world, especially the modern world as you know it, it might well look something like this, because here you have a blinding flash of light and then a feeling of total chaos of just screaming women and children, of a bull, of a horse, a picture of shock, a picture of trauma that seems somehow for the 20th century to have seized all of the terror we feel at the edge of the abyss. That is this painting, Guernica, which has somehow come to symbolize the most potent message we have about war, about the potential of destruction in the 20th century.
A point about this painting that is often raised, and it's very conspicuous when one sees it, is the color, or better, the absence of color. There's been much speculation on why this monumental work is painted simply in grisaille, tones moving from white to black with intermediate grays. A steady stream of visitors came to the studio to meet the famous Picasso. One of them was the young sculptor, Henry Moore, who visited Paris in 1937.
Picasso was painting Guernica then. The Guernica was only half finished, and it was all in grisaille, in monochrome. And he went off into the bathroom and came back, which was also a toilet, and he came back with a very bright yellow piece of lavatory paper that he pulled off the roll. And he wet it and stuck it in the hand of the woman that's running out from the little hut at the back, as though she'd been disturbed while there. And it was a joke and a bit of, and he was amongst friends, and it was all there, you know. But he put it in really to show, now wouldn't colour have given it something. A lot of the preliminary studies of for Guernica were in bright colour, high colour, I mean terrific colour.
There are many reasons for Picasso's use of simple black and white tones. For example, just the sheer awful fact of the bombing, the blinding flash of light, would tend instantly to deplete the world of color and make us just aware of some terrible light in the sky that suddenly turns everything into extremes, very Spanish extremes, of light and darkness. And within this range of black and white imagery, there is a whole tradition of prints that reveal the horrors of war, most specifically, the prints of Picasso's compatriot, Goya, who during Napoleon's invasion recorded like a documentary newsman the most terrible sights that he saw of the carnage in Spain under the French invasion.
I can't think of it other than what it is. And I think it's a masterpiece. And I think the big effort that he put in, there's no doubt, the Guernica was the biggest effort perhaps that Picasso made in his life, because a lot of things came very easy. But this is the proof of his greatness, that he was ready to put a really tremendous effort into it.
After Franco's takeover in Spain, Guernica became the best-known symbol of the lost struggle against fascism. Picasso decided not to allow the painting to be brought to Spain unless democracy had been re-established there. Today, nearly half a century later, it is in the Prado. World War II engulfed France, and Picasso decided to stay in Paris. Life under German occupation was difficult, as his works were declared decadent. But Picasso kept working, turning out many paintings that symbolized the nature of war, such as Cat with a Bird, and also sculptures. Roland Penrose is Picasso's biographer.
When he was asked, now what do you think about your bull's head, which was produced in the middle of the war in some most dramatic moments, and his friends came to see this joke, if you like, and enjoyed it immensely. He said, well, I suppose that in 100 years' time, that will be dug out of a ditch, and some bright young man will come along and say, oh, look, I've got a very fine bicycle saddle and a pair of handlebars, and go off with them in that sense. But there are other death's heads in Picasso's sculpture. One of the great sculptures of the wartime period. It's a skull which has become half fossilized in a way. And it has also this marriage between life and death, because it's become a sort of fossil rolled about on the sea beach.
In 1943, Picasso met a new woman, the young painter Françoise Gillot. She recalls why Picasso joined the Communist Party after the liberation of Paris.
Since many of his friends, especially the poets like Paul Éluard and Aragon, were surrealist poets, you know, before the war. I mean, they were in the underground movement, but as communists, when France was liberated, they were the one who asked of him to become a member of the Communist Party. In a way, it was more a theoretical gesture than a real commitment, in the sense that he didn't go to the cell. You know, each communist has a cell where you're supposed to go. He never did anything like that. But of course, he was sort of giving his name for what he thought was, you know, mostly the cause of the people. He didn't want to be on the side of the wealthy, even though, of course, he was already extremely wealthy at that time. As a person or as a statement, he wanted to remain on the side of the have-nots. Everybody in USSR absolutely detested his work. He was called decadent, etc., exactly treated as badly as he had been by Hitler. So he thought it was rather interesting to be in a position where you are detested everywhere, you know, eventually not liked in the United States because he was a communist, and disliked as an artist in the USSR. So like that, he would be detested everywhere, and that he really liked.
Picasso and Françoise Gillot then left Paris for the south. Picasso had not seen the Mediterranean since the outbreak of the war. In Vallauris, near Antibes, he joined the local potters in experimenting with clay. Françoise and Picasso started a family. First Claude and then Paloma were born. In his art, Picasso returned to his favorite motifs, the everyday people and events in his life. Claude Picasso, today.
Many people feel his painting is autobiographical. It's not true. It's just, yes, something conceptual about what went on in general on that day. And the subject matter happened to be Dora Maar or Marie-Thérèse or myself or Paloma, or a dog or a frog or somebody that entered into the general sort of movement of life on that day or on the day before or whatever it was, you know. There's always some new personage that appeared in his paintings, and it always was caused by an accident.
In 1953, his relationship with Françoise Gillot came to an end. She left him, taking Claude and Paloma with her. Picasso moved to a spectacular villa, La Californie, in Cannes. He met Jacqueline Roch, whom he married in 1961 at the age of 80. At this point in his life, Picasso was considered the most famous, the most rebellious, and the most revolutionary artist of his time, the painter who launched 20th century art. But it was also then that he began to look back with greater intensity and rivalry to the masters of past centuries, a contact he had kept through most of his career. Here at La Californie, and throughout the 1950s and 60s, he chose famous works of the past and offered us his own variation upon them, as if he were saying, I can resurrect the ghost of Velázquez or Delacroix, have a conversation with them, show them what I'm doing, and how I would translate their pictures into my language, the language of Picasso. This was all part of a struggle by Picasso to ward off the possibility of dying. While he was working, death seemed at bay to him.
There is always the presence of death in Picasso's work. Here we have a painting which shows a joie de vivre. Flowers, sunshine, the balcony, the sea. And then the bull's skull, representing his obsession with the presence of death. The still life with bull's skull theme appears in 1909, and again in 1937 and 38. It's a denial of death, and a refusal to think that he has exhausted everything since his youth.
The paintings of the very last years, once thought to be of no great interest, reveal that Picasso continued to be a prodigious painter. He created a whole new approach, using color in a striking expressionistic way, and returning to the themes of his own previous work.
Everyone was astonished that Picasso did 200 paintings in a single year. We ignored this late period too much, perhaps. The paintings of the 1972 exhibition at the Palais des Papes in Avignon left a bizarre impression. We really thought these were the paintings of a rather senile old man. But now we realize that like Rembrandt, Titian, Frans Hals, and Tintoretto, Picasso at the end of his life had found a fantastic freedom and energy.
Picasso is regarded as the most important innovator of the 20th century. He will be remembered for his astonishing ability to confront the art of the past and rework it in his own vision, giving life to it once again. And he may be remembered even more for his ability to take the ordinary facts and experiences of everyday life and transform them into art. It was this gift that let him reach people everywhere.